Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. We are recording this program on the last night of the 2024 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. We're not in Chicago, but we're watching it from Chicago. And one of the reasons I mentioned that is in Chicago is because that has been one of the bases for a very common comparison that we've been hearing from pundits in the media, that this convention is much like the famous, controversial, riveting, and galvanizing convention that was 1968 DNC in Chicago. We wanted to investigate this comparison to see if it holds up, to see if we can use the current circumstances to help us learn more about what actually happened back in 1968. And we are sitting here today with Mike Koncewicz. Mike Koncewicz is the Associate Director at the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. He was recommended to us by the famous historian Timothy Neftali when we were looking for the perfect guest on this subject. And that's partially because Professor Mike is working on a book right now about Tom Hayden. Tom Hayden is the famous student protest leader who was actively involved in the events of 1968, also known as the husband of Jane Fonda. Mike, we're so glad to have you here with us. Before we start, I also want to mention the book that you have written so far, which is They Said No to Nixon, Republicans Who Stood Up to the President's Abuses of Power. So people can go out and buy that now and then wait patiently for the book about Tom Hayden.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Justin, for having me on. And yes, the book will be out in a couple of years. And I would like to add just a quick plug. Since you mentioned Tim Neftali, I worked for him when he was the federal director at the Richard Nixon Library. And I had the pleasure of working under him when he redid the Watergate exhibit there. And to tie everything together, one of the things I'm proudest of is that exhibit included, a basic summary of the protest movements of the Nixon era, starting with 1968 and going up to Nixon's resignation in 1974. I used to actually give school tours at that library, and it was a lot of fun explaining to 16-year-old kids in Orange County, California, what the anti-war movement was during the Vietnam era.
Well, I hope that every media pundit who is making this comparison will take the opportunity to pick your brain as we're about to. Before we get into the serious stuff, I do want to mention, since we're talking about Tom Hayden, a lot of our listeners probably don't know who he is by name, but they might know him if they're aware that he was depicted in an Oscar-nominated movie from a couple years ago, the movie Trial of the Chicago 7, which is about the criminal trial that student leaders at the protest of 1968 attended as defendants. He was depicted in that movie by Eddie Redmayne. And I want to ask you, Mike, how accurate was that version of Hayden? Was it a fictional character, or was it very much like the real Hayden?
Well, yeah. I mean, you mentioned the Aaron Sorkin movie because he directed and wrote the movie. And the hook for me, because the memory of the 60s is naturally fading, particularly when it comes to some of the male leaders of that era. And so when I tell people I'm working on this book on Tom Hayden, people will often say, well, who's that? And then there's two hooks. One you already mentioned. Well, you actually mentioned both of them. One is that he was, Mr. Fonda, as he was often referred to in the 1970s and 80s when they were married. And the second is he's the guy that Eddie Redmayne plays in the movie that was on Netflix when people didn't have many options in the middle of the pandemic. And Google searches for Tom Hayden actually, I think, multiplied tenfold when that movie came out. But so how accurate is it? I always hate to be the historian who ruins things, but it's not incredibly accurate. And perhaps we can get into this. What it gets right, though, is that among the Chicago 7/8, if you include Bobby Seale of the Black Panthers, Tom was, comparatively speaking, the more pragmatic and strategic one. And they get that. Eddie Redmayne is the more cautious. At one point, one of the group, at one point, he lectures Sacha Baron Cohen, who's playing Abby Hoffman, on just being crazy and radical, and that you're going to ruin Democratic Party politics for the next several decades. There's a kernel of truth there, but it's overly simplified. I think the Tom Hayden character in that movie is Aaron Sorkin imagining himself as Tom Hayden.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is that the Tom Hayden of 1968, 69, and 70 is flirting with some pretty wild elements of radical protest movements at that time. He started off the decade in the early 1960s as a fairly idealistic middle-class college kid who famously wrote the Port Huron Statement. This is the founding document of the Students for Democratic Society, otherwise known as SDS. And if you read it, at the time, it's a pretty radical document. They're pushing back on older left people who want to like completely isolate communists, and they're basically making an argument saying, no, we should protect the freedom of communist Americans, and we should welcome them to our spaces. But other than that, most of the policy proposals, if you can call them that, are pretty like just left liberal. They're not especially radical. They are not embracing any sort of like traditional left ideology. It's certainly not a communist document. And that's where Hayden starts off. But the events of the 1960s push him more and more left, but also more importantly into a more confrontational kind of, he embraces more confrontational tactics.
So, Mike, you're saying that you're the historian who's ruining it, but really the truth is spicier than what Sorkin put in the movie. He gave us the sanitized version.
Yeah, I other people have pointed that out. And I don't want to unveil all of the stuff that I'm going to include in the book, but after several years as a community organizer, Tom actually visits North Vietnam. He visits, the so-called enemy twice before the '68 convention. That's not mentioned in Aaron Sorkin's film. He actually helped to bring back 3 American POWs from they were held by the Viet Cong, but this is a part of an arrangement by the North Vietnamese. And so when people first hear about Tom Hayden, they're hearing about him as a young guy from SDS who's going behind enemy lines. That's not a part of the Sorkin film.
Yeah, he's not working in the West Wing, the real Tom Hayden. No.
But then the complicated thing about Hayden is that he's doing things like that. He's writing essays in New York magazines defending the rights of rioters in Newark. But he's also meeting with Robert F. Kennedy. He's meeting with Avril Harriman. He always has one foot or perhaps even just one toe inside the so-called establishment. And that's why he's such a complicated guy. He wants to talk to everyone. So much so that in 1969, when the trial begins, he's actually meeting with the furthest left elements of SDS, which is imploding at a national level, who go on to create the Weather Underground. Hayden does not join with the Weather Underground, but I think it's fair to say he flirts with the idea. And so when he's on trial and he's assuming that he's going to be put away for years, he's talking to Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dohrn. He does not join them, but he's talking to them, and that matters. He's also joining a commune in Berkeley he actually starts it, called the Red Family. And this is a commune made up of 4 houses in Berkeley where they are preparing for the revolution. They're doing karate practice. They're actually doing target practice out in the hills. I have multiple sources on this, and this was reported by journalists decades ago, but it's kind of been glossed over in our memory of Tom Hayden as the responsible one of the Chicago 7. Yeah. And to tie this together, what this shows is that the lines between respectable liberalism and radical politics that line was very, it was all over the place. Everything was up in flux from roughly 68 to 71. Because of, and this is the key difference between 1968 and 2024, the Vietnam War. As intense as the protests have been related to Gaza, they do not add up to what we saw during the Vietnam era, particularly in the late 1960s.
So, Tom, you kind of, Tom, sorry about that, Freudian slip.
You're becoming, that is the job of a biographer, to look at the world through Tom's eyes, to stand in his shoes.
It's a weird job for a historian, but yes, yeah.
And clearly you're telling a captivating story, because that's what you just did to me. So no, but you kind of hit on it there at the end. Obviously 1968 and the issue at hand back then, Vietnam War, and the protests around the conflict in the Middle East that we are kind of witnessing here over the last 3 or 4 days of the DNC convention. I was hoping you could set the table of what the public sentiment, not only the far left, but the public sentiment towards Vietnam was in 1968, and very clearly contrast it to what we're seeing today, which I would argue the public was largely ignoring the conflict in the Middle East.
Yeah. So by 1968, you've had roughly, and then these are estimates, but roughly 30,000 American soldiers had died in Vietnam, likely hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Vietnamese by that point. In 1968, it's the fourth year of the American war in Vietnam. You also had the draft, and the draft made it that everyone had a connection to the war, whether it was a family member or a close friend or a neighbor, a teacher, a coworker. Everyone was affected by the Vietnam War in a way that not only related to Israel and Palestine, but we just have not seen in the 21st century. It was a key difference with the wars of the Bush era, in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's that. So in 1968, as Hayden and other SDSers like Rennie Davis are organizing the Chicago protests, they're dealing with a very different situation where the American public cannot ignore what's happening in Vietnam. It's impossible. And in 1968, you're starting to see signs that the public is becoming not aligned necessarily with the anti-war movement, because one could argue that never fully happens. And if it does, it's at the very tail end of the American experience in Vietnam. But they are questioning the war, and they're questioning whether or not it was ever worth fighting. Polls are certainly showing that after the Tet Offensive of January 1968. And so you have a different political situation in 1968, and that is creating certain elements of hope, a certain amount of hope going into the Chicago protests. Having said that, and other historians have pointed this out, numerous polls have shown that when images are shown of kids getting beaten up by police officers in Chicago, a significant majority of Americans actually oppose the protesters, and they think that police officers were in the right to beat up these hippie kids. Not all of them were hippies, but still, that's the stereotype that they were. I'm sure they were doing something wrong. And that's the consensus coming out of the Democratic National Convention. And then the legacy that has evolved over time is that these protests were a mistake and that they arguably cost Hubert Humphrey the 1968 election. That last point is debatable, but it's part of the legacy of 1968.
Michael, when you're talking about that, I just thought of something else, which is, you're explaining how everyone had some connection to the war because there was a draft. Every young person knew that they could be drafted and sent to the war. And then they have families who then have children who might be sent into the war, or neighbors or friends or so on. I was also thinking about how everyone had a connection to wars and America fighting in wars, because the generation ahead of them had experienced the Second World War, the Korean War, and such a higher percentage of people in the country had served during those conflicts than served during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or the 20-year period that came before the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So at the time, you had people who were not only in their teens and 20s who were concerned about the war, but you also had people in their 40s and 50s, so many more of them who had real experience fighting in a war. And you haven't got that now. You didn't have it 20 years ago when we were talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. You were describing the way that older people responded when they saw images of student protests. How did their own experiences of war, the Second World War, the Korean War, inform the way that they were thinking about Vietnam?
I mean, we're generalizing it a bit here, but I think it's fair to say that a lot of older Americans, particularly older men, despised younger protesters, particularly those who went to college, for having a relatively easy life in the 1960s. That was certainly part of the equation here in terms of how they were viewing what's happening in America's streets in 1968 and then 1969. I mean, it's actually in 1970 when you have another wave of anti-war protests that you have the infamous Hard Hat riot in New York City. I don't know if the two of you are familiar with that episode, but that's when construction workers in Lower Manhattan, who actually are working on what become the Twin Towers, seem like in an organized fashion, they beat up hundreds of mostly high school and college students in Lower Manhattan in May of 1970. And they used their hard hats. 75 kids are sent to the hospital. Fortunately, no one is killed. But this is actually just a few days after the famous Kent State shootings in Ohio. And what they do is they beat up the kids and then they march to City Hall. And what they do, they march together. These are construction workers. These are traditionally Democratic voters. They're mostly older. And they march to City Hall alongside workers from Wall Street. And so other scholars have pointed this out, that you see almost the future Republican coalition that's going to reshape American politics in the 1970s, 1980s. But what they do is when they get to City Hall, someone actually breaks into City Hall and they raise the flag, which was lowered at half-mast in honor of the students who were killed at Kent State. And similar to the protests in Chicago, at Kent State, you saw very similar polls where, yes, people thought this was a tragic event, but when asked to pick who was to blame, student protesters or the National Guard in Ohio, well, they picked the student protesters, even though they were killed. And that's May of 1970. And that's also shaped by this generational divide that's dominating not every discussion regarding the Vietnam War and the role of protest in American society, but it's playing a very important part.
So there is a big generational divide that you're describing. It would make sense that there's, the older generation, especially back then, was more anti-protester against these young, affluent college students. But I guess my question is, how much, if any, of this anti-protest sentiment, pro-police sentiment was driven by the protesters either being perceived to protest against the soldiers who were in an active conflict or actually protesting against the soldiers who were in an active conflict?
Once again, I mean, we don't want to generalize too much. I will say that as a historian who's closely studied the anti-war movement, I mean, there's certainly cases you can point to of, college students doing obnoxious things. We briefly mentioned the Weather Underground. That's more than obnoxious, but there's certain elements that get quite ugly and quite dark within American radical politics. Unlike today, you actually see, and this is a small number. We're talking about at most, a few hundred of the white new left of the late 60s and early 70s that go off and start bombing buildings. This is a statistic that Nixon defenders will still bring up in order to kind of excuse their crimes that led to Watergate, that, Nixon is operating in a time of unprecedented domestic bombings. Now, that should not excuse any of his actions, but those are real statistics. Those bombings happen. And that was led by these really alienated college students who thought that there was no other way to end the war. They were wrong, but the context matters. So yes, older Americans are reacting to some ugly things that are getting publicized in the news. And while protests in the last, several months, particularly in the spring, got fairly intense, they still pale in comparison to what you saw in 68, 69, and 70. Whether you're talking about the numbers or just the level of violence, however you want to measure that, whether it's property damage or deaths or injuries. Look up any college campus in the spring of 1970, 71, and you'll find much more chaotic stories that anything that's transpired over the last, 6 to 12 months. So what does that say? Well, I think we live in a different political culture. People are less willing to engage in political violence for other reasons. But also, I think, even though there are certain elements that are quite ugly in today's protest movement, I think on the whole, and you can see this perhaps with some of the people who are engaged with the uncommitted movement, there is this kind of push towards more pragmatic tactics than there was in the late 1960s. And we could speculate on why that's the case, but I think those are notable differences between the 60s and today.
No, that is interesting. And I just remember I was part of the George Floyd protests, actually got arrested for violating curfew despite being completely peaceful at 7 p.m. on a summer Sunday in D.C. The liberal mayor, arrested us because she wanted to prevent peaceful protesting in our exercise of the First Amendment. At least that's what the cops were telling us. But I do want to bring it back to 1968. You mentioned that the protests back then were much larger in scale than what we see today, even when the college protests were at their height on I believe, the campus of Columbia. Could you kind of give us a little bit of a feel for the scale of the protests, specifically in 68 in Chicago, the nature of the violence? And then could you give us a feel if any of the protester sentiment seeped into delegates at the convention themselves?
Well, those are important questions. Let's start with 68, and then perhaps we can talk about 2024. You asked about violence in 68. So what's shaping this is, well, there's a few things. One, student protesters are engaging in more radical rhetoric because of the Vietnam War mostly, but there's a few other factors, but mostly the Vietnam War in 67, 68 in the quest to kind of end this imperial adventure as they see it. And so 68, Tom Hayden and Rennie Davis, who are two of the early leaders of SDS, they're now kind of aging out of SDS because they're in their late 20s, come up with this idea to organize protests at the Democratic National Convention. They first hatched this idea in the fall of 67, which is a very important time in the development of the anti-war movement. I'll get back to that. But they come up with this idea to confront the war machine. They're assuming that Lyndon Johnson is going to run for reelection. A lot changes between that moment and the summer of 68. Tom Hayden, I mean, it's hilarious. He's basically like if Forrest Gump was a brilliant like left-wing leader. He's at every single moment. So he's in Vietnam in the fall of 67 when they come up with this idea. He brings American POWs back for the first time as this, whether you see it as a sincere gesture of peace by the Vietnamese or a form of propaganda, whatever, it happens. And he's there as this unofficial diplomat. He meets with Castro in Cuba in January of 68. He's at Colombia. He sneaks into Colombia as an outside agitator, so to speak. And so he's there witnessing all of this. I already mentioned he was a firsthand witness to the Newark riots the previous summer. So he's everywhere. And he's occasionally meeting with people like Robert F. Kennedy and Avril Harriman. Johnson drops out. Then the nomination is up for grabs. People are wondering if it's going to be Eugene McCarthy, who's being supported by a different element of the anti-war movement. You have people who are encouraging to get clean for Gene, to cut your hair and knock on doors and back Eugene McCarthy as this pragmatic anti-war senator who can maybe knock off Lyndon Johnson. But Johnson's out of the picture. Eugene McCarthy, is he going to be the nominee? Or is it going to be Robert F. Kennedy who jumps in? And unlike McCarthy's coalition, which is mostly white college students, more moderate anti-war activists, Kennedy has a more interracial coalition. He has Latino farmers in California. Black voters are moving towards Kennedy. And he's also able to pick off some of those older Democrats who maybe they're not thrilled that Kennedy's hair is getting a little bit longer and that he's meeting with people like Tom Hayden, but they trust the Kennedy brand. And then Kennedy, of course, is assassinated in June of 68. And Hayden, there was this debate right before Kennedy was killed about whether or not they were going to have these protests in Chicago. I'm convinced he always wanted them. He apparently even told Kennedy days before he died, "We will work with your people on these protests." What does that mean? We don't know. But after Kennedy is killed, he is much more kind of adamant that these protests have to happen. And Hayden and Davis are touring around the country to convince student organizers to go to Chicago. And their rhetoric is getting pretty heated. Basically saying if there's going to be violence in Chicago, Daley's making that inevitable. We have to be prepared to have blood in the streets. And what happens is that Mayor Daley, this old guard of the Democratic Party, very influential figure, he refuses to give any permits to the protesters. Hayden and Davis are denied over and over again. It's also heavily publicized that there's going to be a really unprecedented level of police throughout the streets of Chicago. So what happens the week of the convention is you get 10,000 mostly student protesters to attend. If you talk to most people in that from that era who were very active in New Left politics, they decided, I'm not going to Chicago. This sounds crazy. And it makes sense. 10,000 protesters were there, and most estimates say that there were somewhere between 15 and 25,000 either police officers or National Guardsmen. and so that's the situation there that week.
So, Mike, there were more police than there
Yes.
were protesters
Yes.
in 1968. That's probably a surprising fact for a lot of our listeners. I was not aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, I have to double check, but it's certainly more than 10,000 police officers. I'm very confident about that. I have to double check if it was more than 20,000. And that's not even counting, FBI agents and other kind of government officials who are all over the city. Because by 68, the surveillance of New Left protesters is reaching another level under the leadership of then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, Hayden is identified as a key activist who needs to be heavily monitored just a few months before these protests. So the reason this matters is that Hayden and Davis, who were hoping for 50 to 100,000 protesters to show up to Chicago, they get 10,000. And they're literally surrounded at times by police officers. Hayden is arrested twice that week. The second time is kind of a dumb stunt where a friend of his lets out the air of a cop who's trailing him. And Hayden did a poor job of being on the lookout. And so he's sent to jail again, but then he's bailed. At a certain point, he even wears a mask, or wears a fake mustache and a football helmet. And he's described in the New York Times as looking as like a junior Fidel Castro. And he's doing this because he wants to freely walk throughout the streets of Chicago. Now, here's the other part. The police surveillance is insane. You could argue it's unconstitutional. It's inhumane. And Hayden, goes a little nuts that week. I think that's fair to say. I would personally excuse it given the context, but many do not to this day. And so what do I mean by that? This is featured very quickly in the Sorkin film, where after his friend and colleague Rennie Davis is beaten up by police officers and his head is actually cracked open. He ends up being fine. He just has a concussion. But in the moment, they think he's severely injured. And Hayden storms the podium at this rally in Grant Park, just very close to the convention. And he gets on the stage, takes the microphone from Dave Dellinger, who was one of the leaders of the anti-war movement and also that protest, and says, we need to march in small groups to the convention. If we march in an orderly fashion, we're just going to get rounded up. That would be a suicide mission. We need to march in small groups. Do what you can to get to the convention. And that's basically telling the crowd, just do whatever it takes to get there. And he famously says, if there's going to be blood, make sure there's blood throughout the streets of Chicago. Now, that's a very provocative speech, and it's recorded by the FBI, police officers. You can actually listen to it online. And it's one of the more kind of hard to defend things during the Chicago trial. But Hayden says it in this moment of passion after months of government surveillance, being arrested twice, and his friend is laying there about to be sent to the hospital. And then so what happens is soon after that, later that day, you have the Battle of Michigan Avenue, where at least a few thousand protesters follow Hayden's advice. Some of them actually go on an orderly march led by Dave Dellinger, a pacifist. Hayden goes there on his own, and he's with the small groups who are ready to kind of do whatever it takes to get to inside the Hilton or to the convention. And then there's other kids who are engaging in some pretty, violent behavior, allegedly throwing bottles of urine at police officers. There's other stories that, it's so hard because you can't necessarily always trust FBI sources or police sources. But there are some people who are very sympathetic to the New Left kids who do confirm that there were kids doing obnoxious things. And what happens to Hayden is he gets right to the front of the Hilton, which is the main hotel for a lot of convention delegates, and he gets pushed through the window, the glass window. You see this in the Sorkin film. He, along with other protesters, get pushed through the window, and you have convention delegates sitting there at the bar enjoying their drinks, and all of a sudden, the war is being brought home, so to speak, at this hotel bar in the Hilton. Hayden is then wandering around the hotel. He is friendly with Eugene McCarthy supporters. So these are the more pragmatic, kind of more moderate protesters, and they are also getting beaten up by cops because cops are just running through the Hilton, just beating up whoever looks like an anti-war kid. And so what happens during that evening, it's August 28th, the third night of the 1968 convention, is that whether you're Tom Hayden or if you got clean for Gene, you're getting viciously beaten up. And in some cases, you're getting arrested. So it's this weird kind of unifying moment for both liberals and leftists in the face of police violence. Now, the question for you and your audience is, well, who's to blame? And maybe a sub question is, would different tactics have produced a different result? Those questions are debatable, but it just gives you a sense of just the historical context that led to some of those famous images of kids getting dragged through the streets of Chicago that tens of millions of Americans are consuming in August of 1968.
Thus, the night that Vice President Humphrey was to receive the Democratic Party's nomination for president was also the night of the bloodiest confrontation. Denied a permit to march to the amphitheater, they gathered in Grant Park, across the street from the now hated Hilton Hotel. The television mobile units, ordered a block away from the Hilton Hotel by Secret Service agents for security reasons, would be unable to shoot the initial provocation, which authorities later claimed started the bloody battle at Balboa and Michigan Avenue. But whatever the reason, a clash did occur, and this is what it looked like. It speaks for itself.
You've painted quite a picture for us there, Mike, and that really actually was what I was going to ask you. I think there's this debate about who's to blame, who took the first shot. Was it the cops? Was it the kids? Maybe it's lost in history. Maybe we don't know. Are historians disputing that question, going back and forth on it?
Oh, well, in terms of the actual violence of that particular evening, no, I mean, there are government reports that say this was a police riot. That police, and I mean, historians, that's the consensus. What there's a bit of a debate about is, what should have Tom Hayden and Rennie Davis and others have done that week? That's more of a debate. But in terms of who caused more violence that evening, it's clearly the police. Even if a kid throws a bottle of urine at a cop, that should not provoke a police riot that leads to 600 people being arrested.
Yeah.
Fortunately, no one was killed at that evening. There was one sort of activist who was killed, I think, the week before the protest, but it's unclear whether or not it was related to the anti-war movement.
Yeah, I suppose that it really kind of goes back to the point you were making earlier about how there were more cops than protesters, which I did not know that until this. And I think that that's fascinating. That really just shed light on, who was more provocative than who in this situation. One thing that I did kind of want to draw out here is we're talking about these protests that were happening in the United States that were so galvanizing and shocking. But 1968 was a year of global protests. It wasn't just in America. So I got my degree from a French university, a master's degree. Some of our listeners may or may not have heard that before. In the French political discourse, there's so much talk about Mai 68, May 1968, when there was an infamous, iconic student protest movement that is a watershed in the political history of France. There was also the Prague Spring, which happened in 1968. I was just in Mexico recently, and I was hearing about their student protest movements in 1968, and I said, you too? It seemed as though this was the year of protest, kind of like 1830 or 1848 in Europe. And another shocking thing that you mentioned, Mike, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, 1968, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, 1968, 1963, we saw John F. Kennedy assassinated. We saw Malcolm X assassinated. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis. People are watching TV, seeing police running riot and beating up students who are throwing jars of urine at the Democratic Convention. Did people feel as though the entire world was melting down? Was this the feeling of the end times?
That's certainly how some people felt. But if you're a young or somewhat young student protester, you think you're living in a revolutionary era. When I interview these folks, they now concede, "Oh, that was silly, that was naive," and yeah, I mean we can agree with that assessment. The economy was quite good in the late 1960s, and I'm not to be a total materialist here, but I think that's an important factor.
Well, that's another point of comparison maybe to today, because the economy is actually doing quite well in the United States, despite the sense of doom and gloom in some quarters.
Yes. I mean, the surface levels, particularly the last few months, are quite good.
Yeah.
Perhaps we can talk about that, because I think our current moment is still shaped by the activism of kind of the post-2008 era, although we'll see how that evolves. But in the late 1960s, it's certainly a prosperous time. And I think, it's part of the reason why things don't go further. Having said that, though, let's place ourselves within the context of 1968. You just laid out that this is a time where it seems like the whole globe is in revolt. I mean, what happens in Paris is that student protests nearly bring down a government. I mean, student protests shut down a country. Hayden is in Paris weeks after that moment in June of 1968, meeting with student leaders. That's actually one of the places where he meets with Avril Harriman. Harriman thought Hayden was this kind of like opening to the new left where he can negotiate with someone like sensible. But Hayden is there. And, when you come home, you want to produce a similar moment. And you can call it naive, you can call it insane. But if you're placing yourself within this context where Colombia seemed insane and then it happened, Paris, that seemed insane, and then it nearly happens. And so the idea that Chicago could like awaken the country and lead to more Americans being on the side of the anti-war movement, while it was, in retrospect, wrong-headed, if you place yourself within that specific context of the summer of 68, you can see why you can convince yourself that a protest, or critics would call it a stunt, could actually lead to something, that would grow their movement.
Did the protests accomplish anything? The more I'm listening to this, and just to summarize, the public was, it sounds like, mostly in favor of construction workers and police beating the snot out of kids that were protesting something they believed in, albeit some of them were violent. The polling shows that the American sentiment on the war was arguably, potentially still in favor of the war, even towards the end of it. And then we look back at these protests that get all of this attention, an Aaron Sorkin movie. What did it accomplish in the real world at the time?
Now, are you asking specifically about Chicago or anti-war protests in general?
I guess, that's a good question. I guess both.
Okay, well, Chicago, I mean, like I said, I'm in the middle of this project, so I'm admittedly still kind of figuring out some of these things. But Chicago as a singular act, mostly provokes a backlash. I'm skeptical about whether or not it led to Richard Nixon winning. I think there are other forces at play. I mean, I think you would have to zoom out and look at what's happening with race in America, what's happening in cities in America, Vietnam in general. And I think there was this just kind of, anti-Johnson sentiment that may have been enough for Nixon to win, regardless of what happened in Chicago that week. And also Humphrey could have done more to distance himself. And once he does, polling does show that he makes it a closer race once he suggests that he wants to have a different path when it comes to Vietnam and could end the war earlier. But the anti-war movement as a whole, I mean, that's the interesting thing. The vanguard of the student new left goes in a really weird place in 1969. SDS dissolves as a national organization, as a meaningful national organization at its peak with 100,000 members in the summer of 69. Now, when the Chicago trial starts in the fall of 69, when Hayden and others are being tried for a conspiracy to riot, you have the largest anti-war protests, arguably in American history. You have the moratorium to end the Vietnam War. That is started by Eugene McCarthy leaders who worked on his campaign, who went across the country to tell kids to get clean for Gene. Well, that campaign ends. Nixon wins. What do they do now? They're still in their mid-20s. And so Sam Brown, who's kind of the young leader of this moratorium movement, says, well, let's do something that's close to like a peace strike, but we can't call it a strike because that's going to be deemed to be too radical. So let's call it a moratorium. And they're able to get some institutional support from liberal Democrats. The most entertaining figure associated with this is Marty Peretz, who later on becomes the editor of the New Republic. This is kind of one of the last years he's on the left. He kicks in a bunch of money. They get money from a few other donors. across the country, and they market themselves as the responsible anti-war kids. And the protests happened October 15th, 1969, shortly after the Chicago trial starts. So if you're watching the evening news in the fall of 69, you see the Chicago trial, you see illustrations of Abby Hoffman's wild hair and, saying crazy stuff, showing up in the courtroom, in a robe with Jerry Rubin. But you also see reports of these moratorium protests getting millions and millions of not only kids, but adults to attend anti-war protests. You get images of anti-war protests in Kansas, in Dallas, Texas. You'll have, for instance, the Dallas, Texas rally is fascinating. You have a rabbi, you have a priest, and you have the Velvet Underground playing in front of about 10,000 people who are willing to oppose the war in Vietnam in Texas. And so what that shows is that, people are turned off by certain elements of the New Left. People are not supportive of the Chicago 7, but anti-war sentiment is growing and it's evolving, and it's eventually going to have an impact on the trajectory of the war, particularly when it comes to members of Congress being willing to cut funds to South Vietnam, starting in 69 with the moratorium moment, but that grows in 70, 71, and 72. I'll add one last thing. Hayden, once he leaves his quote unquote radical phase in Berkeley, what he does is he moves down to Southern California and he starts a new organization called Indochina Peace Campaign with Jane Fonda, who he's dating and then eventually marries. And that organization in some ways takes on a more pragmatic approach. And what they do is they encourage anti-war protesters to lobby their congressmen. And you have these fascinating images of Tom and Jane leading anti-war teach-ins on Capitol Hill in 1974 to fully cut off aid to South Vietnam. So the reason I'm bringing this up is that these protesters, we don't want to stereotype them too much, because someone like Hayden he embraces all different types of tactics. And that's true of a lot of others in the anti-war movement. So
he does eventually become an Aaron Sorkin character. He becomes Josh Lyman by the end of his trajectory. Sort of.
But if you listen to the recordings of some of these meetings from this time, it's still like this gray area where, he's still talking about American imperialism. He knows how to talk the lingo. But yes, he is also meeting with aides to Ted Kennedy. He's buying suits. Jane is buying suits for him to make him look more respectable.
Oh, lovely.
But that doesn't happen until 1974. When he's on trial, he thinks he's going to be assassinated or sent to prison for a long time. And that leads to some nutty things.
Well, I suppose, like we were saying, it was a time when the fear of assassination was probably justified. This Aaron Sorkin movie has completely ruined my understanding of history. You're mentioning these people, and I'm just thinking, Dave Dillinger, I'm like, John Carroll Lynch. You mentioned Jerry Rubin, Jeremy Strong. But Mike, you hinted at something that I kind of wanted to ask about that I think is an interesting point of comparison to today. So you talked about how Hubert Humphrey maybe responded to the protests by adjusting his position on the Vietnam War, how a few years later, some members of Congress seemed open to using the tools of public policy to try to bring the war to an end. But at the time of the 1968 protests, you had Lyndon Johnson as the incumbent president on the Democratic side, who was very closely identified with the war. And my understanding is that Nixon was also a supporter of American action in Vietnam, and he did end up expanding the war. I think that this is maybe an interesting point of comparison to the protests that are happening today, which is that part of the reason why protesters are protesting the Democratic convention in Chicago again is that it seems like the Democrats and Republicans don't have a lot of difference between them in the way that they are approaching the war in Gaza, that both sides seem kind of similar in their policy. And so instead of being able to comfortably endorse one of the party platforms, people who prioritize the issue of Gaza are instead turning to protest the side that they think might be more amenable to changing their position. So I wanted to ask you, after the 1968 convention, was there an appreciable difference between the way that the Nixon and Humphrey campaigns were talking about the Vietnam War just between each other? or was there a lot of sameness in what the two parties were offering?
I mean, this is the era of the Cold War consensus, liberal domestic values and a hawkish U.S. foreign policy. And Humphrey doesn't really break from that. And you could argue about whether or not he actually fully broke from it until October of 68, 4 weeks before the election. The way he talks about the war, it sounds a lot like Richard Nixon. Now, behind the scenes, that's a slightly different story. Johnson is sincerely trying to end the war for sincere reasons and political reasons. I mean, he's a president of the United States, so there's always going to be political reasons. And Richard Nixon is terrified that there will be some announcement in the fall of 68 that could swing the election to Hubert Humphrey. And Nixon's paranoia shapes his actions. And you may already be aware of these stories because they were publicized by great biographer Jack Farrell, who published a book on Nixon, I want to say in 2016, 2017. But he and other scholars like Ken Hughes and a few others have produced, convincing evidence that Richard Nixon and his campaign were actively trying to sabotage the peace talks of 1968. Whether or not it would have made a meaningful difference, you can have a debate. I mean, the point being, though, is he tried, and that's treason. And Johnson finds out about this. Not because they were spying on Richard Nixon. That's something J. Edgar Hoover tells Nixon, but Hoover, for whatever reason, lies about that. It's because Johnson knew that they were spying on Anna Chennault. This is a anti-communist friend of the Nixon campaign who's going to the South Vietnamese government and telling them you'll get a better deal under Richard Nixon. And this is why while South Vietnam is negotiating with the North in the United States to possibly end the war. Well, it doesn't happen, and whether or not Nixon's efforts to sabotage these peace talks made a difference doesn't really matter. What matters is that he was trying to. And there's handwritten notes from H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's then campaign manager, future chief of staff, that confirm that they were well aware of these efforts. So I just wanted to bring that up because I think it's important. But your original question is important. No, there wasn't that much difference in terms of their rhetoric until the very end. And even to the very end, Humphrey is not really going to specifics. He's just expressing a greater willingness to have a phased withdrawal in Vietnam. And Nixon is a little less willing to use that sort of language. Now, today in 2024, if you're a protester who is opposing the bombing of Gaza, you're going to notice that the policy proposals are quite similar. The rhetoric is a little different. It's almost inevitably it's going to be different from Donald Trump, who will embrace the worst aspects of this conflict. Calling Chuck Schumer a Palestinian is just one of the dumber examples of this. But both Harris and Biden, Harris a little bit more so, have shown signs of at least taking the protest movement of today, somewhat seriously. I mean, you saw that in Biden's speech earlier this week. You've seen it in certain moments from the Harris campaign. And so what will be interesting to see is over the next several weeks and months is, what other steps will the Harris campaign take? It seems like they're willing to have private meetings with some of the more pragmatic, moderate elements of today's protest movement. They met with uncommitted delegates in Michigan in a private meeting, but then it was publicized. I think they're still proposing to have this back channel with the uncommitted movement. But I'm actually following the story right now. It seems like they're not going to be able to get a speaker at the Democratic National Convention. They actually leaked the proposed speech, which is pretty sensible and not very controversial if you've read it. But doesn't seem like it's going to happen. There are other steps that could be taken, but we'll see what happens with Harris and if she and her advisors have learned from Hubert Humphrey and Lyndon Johnson's mistakes. They took on a very antagonistic approach to the anti-war movement. Humphrey tries to soften that, but it was arguably too late. That's not to say that they should have embraced every element of the anti-war movement in 1968. That'd be politically impossible. But Chicago didn't have to happen the way it did, and Johnson and Humphrey certainly could have played a role in making Chicago a safer place to protest.
John and I were talking about the Harris and DNC decision not to let these uncommitted delegates speak. And it's important to know that the DNC is supposed to be a party, share unity. And once you give the stage to somebody, you don't know what they're going to say. And if they do say something that's off script, you can't really pull them off stage because that then becomes a national story. I think a lot of pundits, a lot of progressive supporters kind of conflated what was happening with the student protests, the progressives at the time during the summer. From my perspective, humble perspective, they were using the Gaza issue to express energy and displeasure with Biden as the nominee. So a lot of people were getting lumped into this, while there are certainly protesters that are animated by this and the atrocities that are currently going on in Palestine. I think that the polling of young people, the polling of progressives, which was nosediving because Biden's polling everywhere was nosediving because he couldn't speak, was getting conflated with this one singular issue. And once Biden stepped aside and we had the unity around Harris, but also picking a progressive VP candidate in Walz, now you give these young people and progressives 2 wins. So now they are bought in because they feel like they've been heard in 2 different ways. So personally, I think there's next to no risk for how the Harris campaign handles the maybe 10,000 people that prioritize this issue, predominantly in safe blue states. But my question for you is, we saw a rallying around VP Kamala Harris when she was picked, despite not having gone through a primary process. I understand the primary process in the late 60s was different. I understand probably that the selection of Humphrey was painted by the successful assassination of Kennedy. I'm wondering if you can compare and contrast how the Democratic Party felt around the selection of Humphrey without a primary process to the unity that we saw today.
Yeah, if you were, under the age of 30, and the generational divide doesn't explain everything, but within the Democratic Party coalition of 68, if you were in the age of 30, you saw Humphrey as an illegitimate candidate. He did not win a single primary. So granted, you had, by today's standards, a relatively short primary process, roughly between March and June. But even if you were just casually paying attention to the news, never mind being a protester in the streets, you see that McCarthy is winning a bunch of primaries. You're seeing that Robert F. Kennedy, before his death, is winning a bunch of primaries. I mean, hell, even Johnson won a couple before he dropped out. And so you see Humphrey as an illegitimate candidate. At the time, you don't know that Humphrey, especially when it comes to domestic policy, is about as left as you can get for a mainstream politician. When I interview folks now, they will now say, "Oh, we should have realized how good we had it with Hubert Humphrey." In the 70s, he's pushing hard for full employment. I mean, this is a solid New Deal Democrat with a long history of backing civil rights policies. But in 68, no, he's seen as this pro-Johnson hack who's not going to get us out of Vietnam. And so you see far more unity so far. But far more unity today for some of the reasons you just explained. I think Gaza is a factor, but it's not nearly as important as Vietnam. And how could it be? I mean, it's actually, let me kind of counter myself by saying it's rather impressive how large the protest movement is, given that there are no, American soldiers in Palestine. And so I think that's objectively impressive in terms of the amount of attention it's received and the amount of participation there's been so far, even though the protests in Chicago this week have been relatively small. It's still a significant issue. But in terms of what's shaping politics in 2024, no. I mean, most polling suggests it doesn't even crack the top 5, maybe not even the top 10 in terms of what's going to decide votes. And Biden, I think, because of his age and other issues, was this figure that represented kind of an exhaustion with the Democratic establishment. Fair or unfair, that's what he is. And those images are much more important than any specific policies you can point to. The perception of Biden as this old, tired candidate was just further enhanced by Gaza. Not inspire any confidence, even among people who are just casually paying attention to the news whenever he would talk about, October 7th or talking about the bombing of Gaza. He looked old and tired and frail, and it would lead you to freak out. And so I think you're right to point that out. And then Harris picking Tim Walz rather than some other candidates also matters. I mean, let's just like I said, let's remove ourselves as being nerds about politics and just focus on people who just kind of casually consume the news. They see Tim Walz as this guy who sounds sort of progressive. There's the image of him with the kids, free school meals, sounds like Bernie Sanders light, but doesn't have the socialist tag. And also there's the clip swimming around where he's very polite to uncommitted, voters. Stands in contrast with, someone like Josh Shapiro, who made, for various reasons, made a play to kind of more aggressively, comparatively speaking, go after the protesters of today. So I think that does lead to more unity for Harris. And you've seen that this week. You've seen that with figures who maybe in a different era would be much more oppositional, like Bernie Sanders or AOC, or even someone like Keith Ellison, kind of really, really sticking to the unity message. I mean, Keith Ellison, Attorney General of Minnesota, is a fascinating figure. I mean, he's been burned by the Democratic establishment in the past, and he's supporting the protesters of today, but he's also making it clear we need to stay united to defeat Trump. And that is the last factor I think that's worth mentioning. Donald Trump is this unique threat to American democracy. In some ways makes the likelihood of 2024 being very different than 1968 far greater. I mean, Nixon, we now know just Nixon's dark side. In 1968, Nixon successfully depicts himself as an Eisenhower Republican who's going to return America back to normalcy. You don't have that with Trump in 2024. And so that also is going to shape, the liberal left coalition that responds to Trump.
I think this whole thing that we're talking about now, about how the incumbent president, dropped out of his reelection campaign and the nomination went to his vice president without that person running in a single primary. I think that's what tipped these 1968 comparisons into the train of eerie, to use the word of the day, weird. And there were a lot of comparisons. Like, we had the student protest movement over war. That's the biggest one that we're talking about today on this program. But we also have a guy named Robert F. Kennedy running. We also had assassination attempt of a candidate during the race. We had a guy who had previously lost a presidential election running on the Republican side. There were a lot of comparisons, and the one that tied it all together was Chicago. And it was, can you believe the Democrats are going back to Chicago with all of this going on? I know historians hate it when things are overfit, so I want to point out, this is not the first time the Democrats have returned to Chicago. They went back in 1996 to renominate Bill Clinton and Al Gore as the ticket. And that ticket was very successful. They won in a landslide against Bob Dole. So, Mike, I don't know if you are as specialized in the 1990s as you are in the 1960s and 70s, but are you aware of any discourse around 1996 convention? Are you aware of people making these comparisons then? And do you think that in 1996, they actually removed the curse of 1968 by having a successful, peaceful, and winning convention?
I want to actually show you a picture. I mean, I know your listeners won't be able to see it, but this is Tom Hayden at the 1996 convention.
He is Forrest Gump, listeners. We've confirmed. He was at Mais Soissons Weed in Paris. He was at the 1996 convention doing the Macarena.
I don't know if he did the Macarena. That's a good question. I'll have to look into that. But yes, I am well aware of the 1996 convention because I've talked to people about what Tom was doing. Tom Hayden, as the Sorkin film mentions in the end credits, he becomes a state legislator in California. First a state assemblyman, has a very interesting relationship with Willie Brown, who's been in the news quite a bit lately. Willie Brown kind of defends Hayden as long as Jane's fundraising. But then when they split up, Willie Brown becomes very anti-Tom Hayden. But Hayden survives in Sacramento. He gets a state Senate seat in 1992. And in 96, he's an official delegate. So 28 years after he was beaten up and arrested and chased throughout the streets in Chicago, he's an official delegate in 1996. And what he does is, working with the nation, with Katrina vanden Heuvel and Victor Navasky, they create this 1968-1996 event where they invite Crosby, Stills, and Nash, Chuck D. It's this mix of the past and present. They have several Chicago 7 defendants like Bobby Seale and Dave Dellinger are there, and they just commemorate the protests of 1968. And it's held in a theater just a few miles from the actual convention site, and it's a few thousand people. Everyone's older. You can find some videos online, and there's a debate even among that crowd about like, all right, what are we doing here? Hayden, since he's a politician in the 90s, he actually meets with the son of Mayor Daley, a different Mayor Daley in the 90s. And they take photographs together, and journalists love this like, snappy headline story of like, look at Tom Hayden, student protester, meeting with Daley's son. And there's some talks of doing a tree planting to like have like a moment of reconciliation, but it never happens. Hayden is pushing the mayor's office to create a memorial to the protests of 68. And he's even willing to like pose with police officers. There's a great photograph of Hayden actually signing an autograph for police officers in Chicago. Having said that, though, even though you have all these images of peace and reconciliation, there's also shirts that are quite popular among police officers in 1996 that says, I'm paraphrasing here, but it says, "I kicked your father's ass and in 1968, and I'll do the same in 1996." Because there are some very small protests in 96 coming from like the far left.
Controversial year for security guards, I think, as well, right? Richard Jewell.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that took place that summer, too. But yeah, Hayden's in Chicago. Not sure if he's doing the Macarena, but he's willing to play ball with the Democratic establishment while also trying to find, interesting ways to advance environmental reform in California.
That's a very hopeful way, I think, to end this conversation. I think that maybe in a couple decades on, we'll perhaps look back on the protests of 2024 and 2020 and see, progress and conciliation between the protesters and their targets.
I'll say that the convention site, just the convention as a symbol is very important to Tom Hayden. Months before he passed away in October of 2016, 2 weeks before Trump was elected, his last public appearance was at the Democratic National Convention. And he ignored the advice of friends and family where, he was quite sick, but he travels to Philadelphia from California. He's there. He's recognized by all the politics nerds who are there. And he's very worried about a split within the Democratic Party. That was the year of Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton. He famously backed Bernie in 2015, but then in 2016, he endorses Hillary Clinton because he's very concerned about the possibility of Donald Trump. And that angers a lot of Hayden fans in 2016. Nevertheless, he saw the convention as this important symbol of the liberal left alliance in America and its potential. And I wanted to bring that up because I think it's very telling that he felt the need to travel 3,000 miles while he was 76 years old, quite sick. He actually had to leave the convention early because he was so exhausted. And he dies several weeks later. Did he regret 68? That's another question that comes up. Never publicly regrets 68, but there's certainly evidence that he questioned some of the decisions he made that year.
Well, Mike, thanks so much for walking us through all of this. It's a perfect way to cap off a week of convention programming that we've all been watching. And I hope that anyone listening to this gets a little bit more perspective on that scope of history and all the possibilities that come out of a galvanizing event like this.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Justin. I appreciate that you let me blab about the 60s for this long.